A young mother was found dead in her own home, and from the very first days of the investigation, detectives felt the answer was right there in plain sight. But the deeper they dug, the more strange and puzzling details they uncovered. And when they finally got to the truth, it turned out to be so unexpected, it shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Sara Williamson was born on June 20th, 1963, in Florida. Her father served in the Army, so for a time, the family lived on a military base before eventually settling in Albuquerque, New Mexico. At school, Sara stood out right away, especially in math. It later turned out her IQ was exceptionally high, and she earned top grades with very little effort. She also loved to read, gravitating towards crime novels, and by her later high school years, she was already thinking about writing one of her own. She was also energetic and outgoing, had plenty of friends, and loved spending time with her older sister. After graduating, she enrolled at a university not far from Albuquerque and earned a degree in mathematics. While she was studying, she met a man named Cohen, and once they both finished their degrees, they got married. Sara had planned to continue on to a master's in statistics, but she received a very attractive job offer at a military base. After working there for a while, she and her husband moved to Maryland, where she landed a position as a statistical analyst with the National Security Agency. It was a major leap in her career, and Sara quickly proved herself as a talented problem solver who could take on challenges of any size. Around that same time, she began writing her own crime novel about a statistician who solves a murder. 3 years into her marriage, Sara's relationship with her husband started to fall apart, and eventually they decided to get a divorce. She kept working at the NSA and also decided to finally pursue her master's in statistics. Sara enrolled in evening classes at Johns Hopkins University, where she met another student named Lorenzo. At the time, she was 27 and he was 25. Lorenzo was working towards a degree in business and finance, and like Sara, he had already been married once before. The two started dating, and after Sara completed her master's, she married him. They settled in a well-off neighborhood called Elkridge, just outside Baltimore. 3 years later, they had a son, but almost immediately after his birth, Lorenzo began to pull away from the family. His behavior changed drastically. He became controlling of Sara's every move and showed almost no interest in their child. Eventually, Sara decided to file for divorce. Lorenzo moved back in with his parents, who lived nearby, and they agreed their son would spend weekends with him while living with Sara the rest of the time. At the time, Sara was 35, and her son had just turned 1. On Friday, November 13, 1998, she dropped him off at Lorenzo's house, then spent the next day with her best friend Laura. The following morning, Sunday, Laura woke up expecting a call from Sara because they had planned to talk, but Sara never called. Laura tried contacting her, but she didn't answer. That's when Laura noticed she had a voicemail waiting. It had been left at 8:46 p.m. the night before, while she was already asleep. Back then, voicemail didn't show who had called unless you dialed in to listen. Still, Laura figured it might be from Sara and pressed play. To her horror, she heard chaos on the line, strange noises, then a woman screaming, followed by the sounds of a violent struggle. It sounded like someone was being attacked in real time. Shaken, Laura immediately contacted police. She asked them to check on Sara, and officers were dispatched to her home. The first thing they noticed was that the window next to the front door had been shattered, yet the door itself was locked, and no one came when they knocked. Circling around, they found the sliding glass door at the back unlocked and went inside. What stood out immediately was that the alarm system on that door was still armed, which made little sense. If someone had broken in through the front, the alarm should have gone off. When they entered the living room, they were met with a gruesome sight. Sara's body lay sprawled on the floor in a massive pool of blood. The walls, furniture, even the ceiling were also splattered with it. Fearing the worst, officers hurried through the rest of the house, searching for Sara's baby. Not knowing he was with his father, they immediately assumed he might have been kidnapped. Sara's body was sent to the medical examiner, while detectives focused on processing the crime scene. They quickly determined that the killer had most likely entered through the broken front window. That window was also wired to the alarm system, but the sensor was on the frame, so it would only trigger if the window was opened. Smashing the glass didn't set it off. Bloody fingerprints showed that the intruder also used the same window to leave. Inside, investigators noticed something strange. Someone had pulled out all the VHS tapes from a drawer in the living room and scattered them across the floor, and the VCR itself was missing. In the kitchen, every cabinet door had been thrown open, like someone was searching for something specific. At first glance, it looked like a burglary, but detectives quickly started to doubt that theory. Sara's laptop and wallet were sitting untouched on the kitchen table. It felt more like someone had staged the scene to look like a break-in, covering up a much darker motive. The autopsy only reinforced that suspicion. Sara had been stabbed repeatedly, with wounds across her entire body. The sheer level of violence suggested deep, personal anger or hatred toward her. Detectives also couldn't figure out why the killer chose to smash the front window. The back of the house faced the woods and would have offered a much safer way in without drawing attention. That led them to believe the attacker might have known exactly how the alarm system worked, and realized that breaking the back door glass would have likely triggered it. Forensics didn't find any usable fingerprints or solid evidence. All they could do was gather up the huge amounts of blood left behind, hoping that somewhere in the mess they might pick up traces of the killer's DNA, if he'd cut himself during the brutal attack. Meanwhile, officers searched the backyard and discovered a machete, which they believed was the murder weapon. Forensics later confirmed that the wounds on Sara's body matched it exactly. While experts worked through the evidence, detectives confirmed that Sara's little boy was safe with his father. With that worry off the table, they turned their focus to interviewing Sara's friends and family. They wanted to know if she'd had any conflicts leading up to her death, but everyone said the same thing. Sara was kind, easygoing, and never fought with anyone. The only exception was her ex-husband, Lorenzo. Sara's best friend Laura explained to investigators that the divorce had been rough. After their son was born, Lorenzo's behavior completely changed. He had been on antidepressants before, but stopped taking them once the baby arrived. From then on, Sara noticed he showed no interest in spending time with her son. But that wasn't all. Lorenzo also grew controlling, watching her every move. Over time, Sara started to feel like he was angry at her for giving more attention to their newborn than to him. Sometime later, after Sara went back to work, Lorenzo started accusing her of having an affair with her boss. He even showed up at her workplace. Since she worked for the NSA, his accusations triggered a full-scale internal investigation and interviews with dozens of employees. In the end, investigators found absolutely no evidence to back up his claims. Still, Lorenzo refused to let it go. During one of their fights, he even pulled a gun on Sara. That was the breaking point, and she filed for divorce. When Lorenzo found out about it, he tried to hit her while she was holding their baby. Sara fell, and Lorenzo snatched the child and walked out. He dropped the baby off at his parents' house, then came back and told Sara she had to sleep with him, or she'd never see her son again. After that, Sara went straight to the police and got a restraining order against him, but no other action was taken. From then on, she only saw him in court, where they were battling over custody, or when she dropped their son off at Lorenzo's parents' house on weekends, since the court ruled he had visitation rights. At one point, Lorenzo even tried to get a passport for his son so he could take him out of the country, but the court shut that down. Sara's sister later revealed that just one day before the murder, Sara had called her and said she was genuinely afraid of Lorenzo. She was worried he might hurt her before the court made a final decision about custody of their son. Sara even asked her sister to look after the child if anything ever happened to her, because she didn't want Lorenzo raising him. That alone was enough for detectives to take a closer look at Lorenzo, so they went to speak with him. When they told him Sara had been found dead, he dropped to his knees, covered his face with his hands, and started screaming. Once he calmed down, investigators began asking questions. Lorenzo denied any involvement and insisted they should look into her boss, claiming Sara had been having an affair with him. As for himself, He said he was at home that night, and his whole family backed him up. Detectives knew that kind of alibi wasn't rock solid. Family members could easily be covering for him. They took his DNA and fingerprints, and also checked him for any scratches that might have come from a struggle, but he didn't have a single mark on him. They then got a warrant to search Lorenzo's house and car, but once again, came up empty. No blood, no shoes matching the prints left in Sara's house, and no other evidence that could tie him to the crime. In the end, Lorenzo hired a strong defense attorney, which forced detectives to shift their focus. They decided to check out Sara's former boss, but by then he had already left the NSA and moved away. When the NSA learned about Sara's murder, they decided to assign their own team to investigate the case alongside local police. They reached out to Sara's former boss, and once again, he insisted that their relationship had been strictly professional. He also said that on the night of the murder, he was having dinner with friends in another state, and that alibi checked out. With no other real leads, detectives tried to squeeze more information out of the voicemail Sara had left her friend in the middle of the attack. They were hoping to catch the killer's voice, but instead, they picked up something else. After experts cleaned up the recording, investigators thought they could hear Sara screaming the name Mike. That immediately raised a red flag, because Lorenzo's brother was named Michelangelo, but he went by Mike. He lived in the same house with Lorenzo and their parents, and according to him, he'd been home the night Sara was killed. Detectives started wondering if Mike might have carried out the murder himself, maybe to make sure the child stayed in their family. They brought him in for questioning and played the enhanced tape for him, but he said he couldn't hear his name on it at all. And to be fair, the theory was shaky from the start, because even on the cleaned up version, the recording was so unclear that you couldn't make out any distinct words. Mike denied having anything to do with the murder, but during questioning, detectives noticed he was visibly shaking. And when they drove him back home, the moment he stepped out of the car, he immediately threw up. It all looked suspicious, so the lead detective gave him his phone number and told him to call if he ever decided to come clean. But instead, Lorenzo's attorney reached out to police and said that from now on, they'd only be allowed to speak to his brother in the presence of a lawyer. After that, detectives checked out Sara's first husband as well as Lorenzo's ex-wife, but both were cleared. As for Lorenzo's ex-wife, investigators asked if she'd be willing to help them, and she agreed. Police tapped her phone, and she called Lorenzo, carefully trying to coax something new out of him. But he stuck to his original story and kept insisting he had no idea who killed Sara. There was also another theory tied to Sara's job at the NSA. She had access to classified information, and detectives couldn't rule out that this might have been a motive. But the special team from the NSA looked into it and ultimately concluded there was no connection between her work and the crime. A month after the murder, the lab finally finished processing all the evidence from Sara's house, and they found DNA from an unidentified man in 3 different blood samples. Detectives immediately compared it to Lorenzo's DNA, and to their surprise, it wasn't a match. The same went for his brother and his father. The blood didn't belong to any of them. This twist shocked investigators, who had been almost certain Lorenzo was involved. But now, with the DNA pointing to a completely different man, his guilt didn't look so clear anymore. The problem was, without any other leads, there was no way to figure out who the real killer was, and the case went cold for months. Detectives kept digging, even checking known serial offenders in the area, but nothing came of it. Later, they sent the voicemail recording to the FBI, where experts were able to clean it up more effectively. Turned out, Sara hadn't said Mike at all. It was just a scream. That went on for 7 months, until the case suddenly took a shocking turn. On June 1st, 1999, the lead detective got a call from the Baltimore County Police Department. An officer there explained that one of their inmates had just confessed to killing Sara. The inmate was a 19-year-old named Ardell Tickles, who'd been arrested 3 months earlier for an armed robbery at a McDonald's. While sitting in jail awaiting trial, he told his cellmate that he'd murdered a woman in her own home. The cellmate quickly struck a deal with prosecutors, wore a wire, and started asking Ardell for details about the killing. Ardell explained how he'd broken into the house through a window and attacked the victim with a machete. He described her injuries with such precision that detectives had no doubt he was talking about Sara. He even gave the exact date it happened, the night she was killed. Ardell bragged about how his victim died while he kept striking her, saying he wanted her to suffer as much as possible. Finally, when his cellmate asked why he'd done it, Ardell gave an answer that floored detectives. He said a former coworker had paid him $5,000 to kill her. Investigators were convinced he wasn't lying about being the killer. His confession included details that had never been released to the public. The lead detective headed straight to the jail to confront him. He told Ardell he'd be facing first-degree murder charges and made it clear that they already had his confession on tape, so he'd better start talking. Ardell didn't deny a thing. He admitted he had killed the woman without even knowing her name. He added that he didn't feel any remorse because, according to him, Sara was a bad person. He claimed the former coworker who hired him for the job told him that Sara once pushed a pregnant black woman down a flight of stairs and spit in her face. Ardell also said that instead of the promised $5,000, he only got $3,000, but the money didn't matter to him as much as punishing her for what she'd supposedly done. At that point, the detectives laid out 3 photos: Lorenzo, his brother, and his father, and asked Ardell which one of them had hired him. To his surprise, Ardell didn't recognize any of them. He explained that the person who hired him wasn't a man at all, but a woman, though he didn't know her name. That raised even more questions. How could he have worked with this woman and not even know who she was? And what kind of woman would want Sara dead? One thing was clear though. This woman knew Sara very well. According to Ardell, just days before the murder, she drove Ardell to Sara's house and told him the best time to strike would be Saturday because Sara would be home alone. She even explained how her alarm system was set up and warned him not to tamper with it so the neighbors wouldn't hear a thing. With this new lead in hand, detectives shifted their focus to finding the woman behind it all. Ardell had worked at a nursing home laundry in Baltimore, so police pulled the employee roster, hoping he'd recognize someone. But what they stumbled across was far more shocking. One name on that list instantly told them who the mysterious woman was. Her name was Amelia, and she was Lorenzo's mother. Detectives went back to the jail and showed Ardell a photo of Amelia. Without hesitation, he confirmed that she was the one who had hired him. What really stunned him, though, was learning that Amelia wasn't just some stranger. She was Sara's mother-in-law. He explained that Amelia often brought the little boy to work, and he'd assumed she was just the child's babysitter. When he realized that the boy was actually Sara's son, Ardell was floored. He said the only reason he agreed to the murder was because he believed Sara was racist, and he thought he was punishing her for that. But now he understood he'd been manipulated from the very start. Of course, there was no undoing what he had already done, and for detectives, the real challenge was still ahead. Ardell's confession alone wasn't enough to put Amelia away. They needed hard evidence to prove she'd orchestrated the murder. Talking to staff at the nursing home, detectives found a woman willing to cooperate in exchange for full immunity. She told them that on the day of the murder, Ardell had asked her to help him become a killer by renting a car for him, since he was too young to do it himself. She thought he was joking and went along with it. But just a few hours after she handed over the rental, Ardell brought it back, and his boots were covered in blood. He told her he had just gotten rid of the devil and asked for her help. They drove out to a vacant lot where they burned his bloody boots. On their way back to the car, 2 officers stopped them. The cops searched the vehicle and even found a knife under the seat with blood on the handle. But instead of arresting both of them, they simply took the knife and left. Digging deeper, detectives also discovered that just weeks before the murder, Sara's mother-in-law had withdrawn $2,500 in cash. Soon after, Ardell deposited nearly the exact same amount into his own bank account, a connection that was hard to ignore. Lab experts compared Ardell's DNA with the sample found on the machete, and it was a perfect match. That was enough to charge him with murder, and right after that, detectives went after Amelia. She was brought into the station, where she called Lorenzo. She told him she was probably going to prison, and he didn't even ask what for. His reaction was strangely calm. After that, Amelia refused to answer any more questions and demanded a lawyer. Knowing that the evidence they had might not be enough to secure a conviction, the lead detective decided to bluff. He told her that if they uncovered proof Lorenzo knew about the murder, their family would never see the child again. Amelia sat in that room for a few hours before finally giving in. She waived her right to an attorney and told detectives she was ready to confess. She admitted that she had never really liked Sara and thought she was ungrateful. Things only got worse after the baby was born. Amelia believes Sara wasn't raising him properly, but Sara never listened to her. Over the next few months, the tension kept building, and their arguments became more and more frequent. When Sara finally filed for divorce, Amelia panicked, afraid she'd never see her grandson again. And that's when she snapped. She wanted revenge, but insisted she never meant for Sara to be killed. According to Amelia, she had casually mentioned her frustrations to Ardell at work, and he told her she needed to get back at Sara for the disrespect. He even offered to help, promising to take care of it. Amelia claimed that Ardell told her he only planned to throw rocks at Sara's house to scare her. Detectives doubted that version of events, especially since Amelia had paid him a large amount of money, far too much for something as petty as tossing a few stones. In the end, Amelia said no one else in her family, including Lorenzo, knew anything about her involvement. Investigators never found any evidence to prove otherwise, so prosecutors went ahead and sent the case to court. The first to stand trial was Ardell. He claimed Amelia had manipulated him, tricking him into killing an innocent woman. He even said he'd spent the past months praying for Sara and her family. But the jury wasn't moved, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Amelia's trial began in January 2000, and not a single member of her family showed up. Her lawyer tried to argue there wasn't enough to directly tie her to the murder, but the evidence was stacked against her. In the end, she too was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. In 2009, she filed an appeal, claiming Sara didn't deserve to die and that she had long since forgiven her. This questionable statement had no effect, and the original sentence was upheld. As for Sara's son, he continued living with his father. Lorenzo eventually remarried and had 3 more children. On February 8, 2023, he passed away at the age of 57. Amelia, now 89 years old, is still serving her life sentence. Ardell eventually became eligible for parole, but when he applied in 2024, his request was denied. He remains behind bars to this day. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.